Nvidia just made a huge claim, and it's that this February, $550 is going to get you a graphics card with the performance of an RTX 4090. Of course, $550 is a lot less than $1,599, which was the RRP of a 4090. But of course, well, there's a hell of a lot more to this story. On one hand, we've got Nvidia now providing more genuine value-based competition at the lower end of the market. But what's really happening is Nvidia are digging in their moat. They're digging it deep. And in business, your moat is your unique advantage. The sort of thing that just makes you strong. But for your competitors, it is a real expensive problem to solve and overcome. And for Nvidia, DLSS always was that. But the new version is substantially different from what came before. And it's different in a way that is going to be a massive pain in the ass for AMD and for Intel. So let's get into the story. First, here's a look at the new cards that they're bringing to the market. So we've got the 5090, which costs $2,000, but then the 5080 costs $1,000. The 5070 Ti is $749, and then the big headline grabber is the 5070 for $549. And that is a price ladder that is designed to absolutely not repeat the problems of the 40 series. If you're not aware, the 40 series was catastrophically priced at the start, so the 4090 was an RRP of $1,599. But the 4080 was going for $1,199. It wasn't that much cheaper, and the strange thing was that in performance per dollar terms, if you had the money, you were actually better buying a 4090. But still, that generation was very expensive overall. So comparing the pricing ladders, that does explain why we get a, air quotes, cheaper 5090, even though it is a hell of a lot of dollars. So the TLDR is the generation to generation, the most expensive card is now more expensive, but every other card, relatively speaking, is cheaper. And where things get particularly interesting, of course, are the performance claims. Though performance, as measured in frames per second, does not necessarily mean horsepower. What Nvidia claim here is a doubling generation to generation. That's what they say makes a 5070 trade blows with a 4090. Again, massive caveats to follow. Of course, that's because DLSS is driving a hell of a lot here. If you actually look at the raw FPS gains, just the raster performance, no DLSS, as an example in Far Cry 6, you're up 15 to 20%, which is basically what one would expect from generation to generation, but along with that, we're also seeing a higher power draw with this series of cards. And this really is what we all would have expected. It's Nvidia taking their competitive advantage and doubling down on it. As an example, let's look at Cyberpunk 2077 maxed out. They show it hitting 109 FPS, full ray tracing on a 4090, and that is handily crushed by the 5090's 234 FPS, which is absolutely massive. So, big picture, it's raw horsepower gains that we would basically expect, but what really is the game changer here is the AI performance absolutely soaring, and that is entirely what fits Nvidia's modus operandi. That's absolutely what's driving up their stock price, and certainly with these cards, they do have substantial performance gains on AI workflow stuff, but, well, we're here to talk about games, so let's put that aside. And let's talk about the big story here, because the next generation of DLSS, it's going to be interesting. There may be bugs, whatever, but what it is a strategic masterstroke. Remember that fundamentally the main performance uplift generation to generation is local generative AI performance, right? And that is what powers one of the new features in DLSS 4, which is called multi-frame generation. So basically, right, your DLSS 1 and 2 is AI-based upscaling. Well, neural net-based upscaling. Let's not sweat all the minutiae there. Basically, your game is rendered at a much lower than native resolution, and then it's upscaled in real time. It's pretty damn impressive, and that way you get better performance without needing way more raw horsepower. And especially if you're going from, say, a 1080p monitor to a 4K one, that's just a lot more pixels. Now, DLSS 3 then brought in frame generation. So rather than just upscaling from a lower native resolution to, make your full frame, it would also generate your next frame. And of course, it's not doing that in a purely, let's just randomly guess what the next frame will be. It's talking to the game engine, doing all of that. But still, it would actually add some latency. But of course, it would radically improve your frame rate because that frame is literally generated. And what that's going to mean is a way higher frame rate, even though you do actually have more input latency. Of course, Nvidia has their own feature called Reflex that basically is there to counter the latency. But then DLSS 4 is bringing multi-frame. So here's basically what that's like. DLSS 3 generates 1 frame. So you've got your upscaled frame and then a generated frame. DLSS 4 generates 3 frames. So you've got 1 upscaled, 3 generated, total of 4 frames. Now that is way more generated pixels than before. And that actually means that the raster performance gains, which just think about that, your traditional game performance, those are mostly irrelevant compared to transformer performance, which basically, let's just say, that's a lot of the architecture that runs generative AI stuff. So say if you're running Midjourney or ChatGPT generates an image for you, that is done on GPUs in a data center somewhere, and it's actually fairly expensive. It's the sort of thing that if you were to try to do it on your local machine, you may not have enough VRAM and it may take quite a while. But it's that kind of performance that these cards are substantially better at, which is why they're able to generate more frames. But here's the thing, multi-frame generation is only available on the 50 series. So if you think about, say, the 4090 to 5070 comparison, yeah, there's a fairly obvious reason why suddenly this 5070 is able to trade blows with a 4090. They do not have equivalent raster performance, absolutely nowhere near close, but multi-frame generation does mean that a 5070 will be hitting 4090-like frame rates. Now the thing is, the DLSS 4 is actually for all RTX cards. That's from the 20 series through to the 50 series. The 50 series is the only one that does multi-frame generation. The 40 series is the only one that does single frame generation, but ray reconstruction, super resolution, and the deep learning anti-aliasing are on all of the cards. And where things are kind of interesting is that Nvidia claims that 4.0 brings substantial benefits because they've basically, from what I can tell anyway, moved from their own neural net based architecture, from like the older versions of DLSS, to basically stuff that is way more similar to what's going to run the image models that you're probably aware of from the popular news and OpenAI and all of that. And that could sound like a lot of fluff, but basically what Nvidia claims is better temporal stability, less ghosting, and better detail for moving objects. Now I don't know about you, right? But for me, I kind of think that a lot of modern games look like absolute slop mud, even if they've got loads of impressive features. And that's because if you look in the distance, what do you see? You see shimmering, ghosting, artifacts that just look wrong. I mean, we've got way more complex visuals. We've got lighting that back in the day, you had to be somebody who was reading the new papers from SIGGRAPH, graphics programming convention. You would have to be reading that to be thinking about ray trace lighting in real time. No, we have so many impressive things, but do you know what we also were able to do back in the day? With our games that had way less graphical features. We could run them at their native resolution, and they would actually look crisp and sharp, as opposed to just smears of Vaseline. And at its worst, DLSS is just Vaseline? The kind of thing where if I take my glasses off, man, it looks amazing. The second I put these suckers on, oh dear, I can see all the visual flaws. Now, if Nvidia have been able to solve more of those visual artifacts and those flaws that are inherent to basically the way that they are just upscaling and generating most of the pixels that you actually see, I guess all of them really, well, that actually could be really big for this feature. I would say actually being a good thing. And that's where, whenever I hear the performance uptick claims, and I've been suspicious of this for a long time, I just think that with Nvidia, and everybody who does this, you're not wrong. There is an increase in frames per second, but those frames per second are not equivalent in quality to just completely natively rendered frames that do not use loads of upscaling. So if DLSS 4 is bringing proper benefits across the board there, this actually could be quite big. But that's honestly not really my point. So you've probably noticed that Nvidia are at the top of their game. And that's because, as much as through the years they have been criticized a lot by gamers, and rightly so, and a lot by developers and locking people into key technologies, do you know what Nvidia are? They're goddamn strategic geniuses. And this is going to solidify their stranglehold over the market, because now DLSS is going to be a little bit more in your hands. Well, I suppose I should give you a trigger warning. Do you remember the Starfield PC launch? Wasn't that a great time? The game was a beast to run, and not because it looked amazing, and Bethesda included AMD FSR, which is not good. I mean, it's not great. Neat and helpful, but it does not hold a candle to DLSS, and consumers were furious. So much so that a modder actually picked up plenty of dollars, plenty of Benjamins over in Patreon by basically modding it in, and then quite soon after Bethesda added official DLSS support. And I bring this up to say that for so many people, DLSS support is a blocker to running a game at an acceptable frame rate. And we do live in a universe now where, let's be real, unless you are spending huge amounts of money on cards that can murder it on raster performance, like a 4090, you are going to feel like you need DLSS or an equivalent technology to actually get frame rates that really just meet your standards. And that is especially the case as we're more and more moving to monitors above 60 Hz. For official support, 75 games will support DLSS 4 on launch. But the big news is that's not going to stop you, because the new Nvidia app, which by the way, no longer requires email, I think even right now, so yeah, update that thing. It has a feature coming called DLSS Override, which basically just means instead of a modder doing it, you can do it yourself from the Nvidia app. Now, if you're a customer, this is absolutely amazing. It guarantees that you can access the full value proposition of the card that you've bought. I say guarantee. Obviously, it may not work. It's just something that you can flick on. But in terms of consumer psychology, well, now it means that your new card designed for DLSS can bring its DLSS absolutely everywhere. And for Nvidia, what this does is it solidifies their dominance in the market, it solidifies dependence in DLSS, and it deepens their moat. The point being that just like a moat makes it harder to attack a castle, this moat, DLSS, makes it harder for their competitors to actually fight, but in way more deep ways than most people would think. At the most fundamental level, what Nvidia are able to do is take raster performance, your traditional GPU performance, and more decouple that from the end user experience. And ultimately, what they're trying to sell an end user is the end user experience, not necessarily the raw raster performance of the piece of hardware. And if you're Intel or AMD, this is a goddamn big problem. DLSS is Nvidia's technology, and they do have competing things. You've got AMD FSR and Intel XeSS, but they've always trailed behind DLSS, and AMD has actually often fallen behind Intel, I think especially on frame generation stuff. But the big picture point is Nvidia forced their competition to play catch up to them, and this will continue. That's because AI is Nvidia's home turf. That is what they are completely geared to as a company. Even look at the little $3,000 AI supercomputer thing that they're now marketing, so that you could basically get two of those and run like the Llama 405 billion model locally, which is kinda crazy. That is how Nvidia wants to crush and dominate. And if DLSS Override actually works, then Nvidia's, in the minds of almost all consumers, superior solution in DLSS, even just 3, but let's say 4, that will then apply to far more games, and this is an example of where Nvidia have always been winning, and that is strategic dominance. And I say strategic because they've made so many tactical cock-ups. Just take a look at the 40 series, right? Take a look at all of the fun times of the crypto mining, remember that. But here's the big point. With the 2000 series, they stopped talking about the raw raster performance. We had Jensen saying, how many RTX ops could they do? What is an RTX op? Well, it's basically just Nvidia seizing new ground to compete on, and they choose to compete where they believe that they are strongest. And then, through extremely impressive tech demos, consumers start to think that ray tracing is a really cool, good thing, which means if you're AMD, if you're Intel, now you've got to catch up. But you've got to catch up fighting Nvidia on territory of their choosing. And that is what this DLSS push is, as is the frame gen push. So as much as people want AMD to pull off a Ryzen style comeback in the GPU front with the Radeon cards, that's not going to happen unless AMD can find a new paradigm of performance. How are they going to do that? Because as far as I can see, well, Nvidia have all the advantages here. Now, we do have to give some credit to Intel. That's because XeSS is actually fairly strong. It's been quite impressive in how it's caught up, and the Battle Mage cards do appear to be a true value king. But as far as I can tell, it'll be less Intel dethroning Nvidia and more Intel kind of consuming the corpse of AMD, which makes me sad because, like with the Ryzen cards, sometimes AMD can be a bit plucky and you want them to win. But here's the thing, per the Steam hardware survey, Nvidia have got 75% of the market, AMD have got 15%, and Intel have 8%. That's for GPUs, and remember that for AMD and for Intel, that does include integrated GPUs and APUs. Things like, the Intel Iris graphics that's on your laptop. I mean, if you look at Intel's 8%, just shy of 2% of that, so a quarter of it, is Iris Xe, which is basically laptop stuff, which is ultimately to say, good God, this is Nvidia going for utter dominance. And what's real notable in DLSS 4 is that it brings benefits to everyone on an RTX card. So if you have a 40 series, you won't necessarily feel like you need to upgrade. And that's because basically Nvidia wants everybody to be relying on DLSS as much as possible, because that is where Nvidia stands to gain the most. So be it the improvements to the ghosting, temporal stability, or just the big headline-catching frame rate stuff with multi-frame gen, they just want you to always think, I'd love to buy AMD, but I'd be stupid to. Here's where we stand. Taking a look at the new lineup, the 5070 looks great at its current price, if you can buy it at $549, and that is a big if, because these cards do also appear to be generically strong in local AI work, so because of that we should probably expect more demand. As an example, sometimes I use the Topaz Labs gigapixel stuff in thumbnails, and there's even the Topaz Labs video AI. A lot of that stuff is local AI performance. So more and more workflows will actually benefit from what these GPUs can do. I don't know if it's going to be like the crypto mining situation, but we could see a lot of people wanting to snap these cards up for non-gaming related reasons. But even with RRP, that's a massive stack of money, which is why the Intel Arc B580 is a fascinating card. You see, it's half the price. It outperforms, in many cases, a 4060, and it's competitively priced with one, and that is fascinating. So currently the 50 series has got no competitor, but by launching their the Battle Mage architecture competition to the 40 series late in the generation, Intel have actually came up with a real damn good value proposition. That's because the B580 is outperforming a 4060 in raster performance, and the XeSS, upscaling sort of DLSS competitor from Intel, is actually really good and has a frame generation version, but of course, no multi-frame yet. Now, where it's interesting is, of course, Nvidia's new drivers. And that's the other point, the other part of Nvidia's strategic masterstroke here. And it really doesn't even come down to reality. Because we can sit down, we can crunch numbers, we can compare spec sheets and try to be the most informed consumers. But the reality is, most consumers make decisions emotionally, and it's the psychological hooks and framing that matter. So, get this. Even if a game developer does not officially support frame generation, I can open the Nvidia app, I can force it on, and get nearly double the frame rate. Now, if I was structuring, say, the first 10-second hook of a YouTube video, that would be a pretty damn good one. And I'm not saying that's their sales copy, but psychologically, whenever a user is contemplating a lower end version of a 50 series, they're going to think about that, because Intel's offering is really strong, but it's the frame generation from Intel that would allow it to really one-for-one compete with a lot of these Nvidia cards in big AAA games. And that's where we have to remember that we have spent a lot more time as hunter-gatherers in the savannah than we have as PC gamers. Humans are still very much fear and loss averse in their psychology. In our psychology. I'm not a robot, at least that's what I want you to think. My point there is, for so many people, just the psychological comfort of knowing that they can turn on DLSS, that will actually be quite large, and it's why I brought up the Starfield story. Imagine if the Starfield story was to happen again, but with DLSS override. Those with Nvidia cards could just click the button, get the superior solution, and have better frame rates than people who didn't go with the dominant market leader. That is the kind of situation that Nvidia wants to be in. And so our lesson here is that as consumers, man, there's some pretty damn cool looking technology coming. It is going to enable a lot of us, I think, to get better frame rates at a lower price point. The high end of the market is absolutely soaring. There's still concerns about, well, will AI stuff just mean that so many of these GPUs will be gobbled up and we will have pricing and availability issues? But more than anything, strategically, They have outplayed everybody. Now Nvidia is ascendant, and they are fighting all of the other GPU companies on the ground of their choosing. Not even just on the ground of their choosing, but, you know, the weapons of their choosing. Nvidia have put all their stats, all their talent points into one build, and they're forcing everybody else to compete with the same build, the thing that Nvidia have specialized in. So there you go. Jensen Huang, he's a smart cookie. That's it for today's video. If you want some more news, hit up this one next.